Welcome to Mission Critical, a webinar series brought to you by CIM Magazine and SGS Natural Resources. I am your organizer, Michelle Beacom, Managing Editor of CIM Magazine. Today's Mission Critical presentation is on rare earth elements. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. To ensure you have optimal audio, if you joined by computer, please make sure you've selected the computer button. If you've joined by phone, please make sure you've selected the phone button. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. It's underneath the question mark. And that's it. The questions will be held until the Q&A period after the presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to introduce Ryan Bergen, who will moderate today's webinar. Ryan is Editor-in-Chief of CIM Magazine and Director of Media and Marketing at the Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy and Petroleum. Welcome, Ryan. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah, it is my pleasure to welcome David Anonychuk back for another discussion on critical minerals. David is Global Vice President, Metallurgy and Consulting at SGS Natural Resources and co-chair for the Critical Mineral Council under the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And I think you've probably got other advisory board titles as well, but we'll, I think, leave it at that. Welcome, David.
Hey, Ryan, great to be back on the next installment in our series.
And yeah, it's been full. There's been a lot going on. Yeah, so maybe I just want a little background on SGS, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, so maybe a lot of you have worked with us in the past, but in case you haven't, SGS, we're a leader in testing, inspection, and certification, and I'm the global VP for Metallurgy and Consulting in our minerals business. But SGS is a large company. We work across every major supply chain there is, 100,000 employees around the world. And then, when it comes to minerals, we work across, all the way from the geochemistry, from exploration, all the way through geology, mineralogy, the metallurgical testing, piloting, and into engineering. So we work across that value chain for all commodities, like I said, gold-based metals and critical minerals.
Right. And so, yeah, today we wanted to focus on rare earth elements. It's funny, when I was prepping for this discussion, I came across the headline, so what's the fuss about rare earth elements? And it was from 2009. And it isolated a number of things. Chinese control of supply, security concerns, and here we are, 2026, and I think that those questions haven't really been answered. The fuss, it seems, has returned to rare earth elements, and so yeah, that's why I wanted to invite you back here, because I think there's been a lot of developments in this space over a short period of time, and yeah, it's sort of how did we get to this point? So maybe to begin, let's just lay down the foundation here. And could you just give us an introduction to rare earths?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Just to start off, you mentioned 2009. A lot has changed since then, and we're going to get into it as we get into the into the webinar. But coming back from PDAC, what stood out, gold, copper, and rare earths. Rare earths is definitely, I'll say, top of the list in terms of excitement. But let's start to kind of, talk about what actually are rare earths. So this is the periodic table with all the critical minerals from the Department of Energy in the US, and the rare earths are the ones in blue. And this includes scandium, yttrium, and the lanthanoid series. Now, often people say lanthanides, that's what people are used to, but the modern word is lanthanoids because it means the word, they are the same, is what that means. And often we hear also about gallium and germanium, but those aren't rare earths. Those are actually rare metals, and they're classified differently. And a lot of this has to do with their properties, and where they sit in the periodic table. But rare earths are classified into lights and heavies. And here on the table, the lighter ones are shaded as the light rare earths, and the heavies are the darker blue. And the main difference is the atomic number, how abundant they are. So the lighter ones tend to be more abundant. But also how easy is it to recover when you're designing a process. So again, the lighter ones are easier typically to recover versus the heavies. But on the other side, because it's more difficult to recover the heavies and they are less abundant, then the prices for those are higher as well. So now if we look at, okay, but what do we actually do with these rare earths? How do we use them? And there's kind of three essential pillars, and the one that gets all the attention are magnets. You've heard of turbines, in terms of for wind energy, you have these high-powered magnets. They can also handle high temperature. We go on to the defense side in magnets. They're the ones that are helping on that control. I hate to talk about, like I said, the negative side, the defense side of things, but they are inherent to the defense sector. Here, if we look at just the end use, like even on the military side, 400 kilos in, fighter jets, destroyer, 2,600 kilograms, and submarines, 4,600 kilograms. But that's not the largest end use. And in fact, it's the everyday items, right? It's iPhones, it's your AirPods, it's in your screen, the brightness on your screen, it's all rare earths, as well as electric vehicles. So that is by far the biggest part of that sort of end use demand.
And has the relative demand for these remained sort of relatively constant? Like say electronics or renewables, are they still or what is the primary?
Rare earths is magnets are definitely the majority of the market when we look at the end use products. Yeah. And in general, because it's tied to high technology applications, it is a high growth business in terms of that, sort of end use. But is it a big market? No. You look at copper, 25 million tons, or nickel, 4 million tons. We're talking somewhere around 200,000 tons a year of rare earths, which makes it small and niche, but obviously very valuable because there's such few players in that, in that game.
Okay. And you had mentioned scandium. Is that sort of in my understanding, it is related to rare earth elements, or it is within that group?
Yeah, scandium is in there, but it's used in a different way. Often the importance of scandium, it's used for scandium aluminum alloys. So that would be like aerospace, that would be, airplanes. If you're looking at super high strength with aluminum alloys, if you're building the shell of, any, aviation vehicle, you're going to want that scandium in there to make it super light, in terms of that alloy. So again, there's such a, there's a small number of projects out there, whether they're scandium or rare earths, but they all have very high utility. And of course we all have them. Those elements are found in Canada.
Right. Okay. So we talked about the end uses. Maybe we could talk a bit more about their origins. Like I know we have Canada is well endowed with natural resources, among them rare earths. So yeah, where are they located, and what makes them, I guess, different as a project?
Yeah, and so I have here a map for NRCan. This is a bit outdated, so it's from 2023, so it doesn't have the most, let's say, the modern names, if the company names have changed. But it does show here that, look, rare earth projects are across Canada. Now, if I compare with gold, anywhere from prospecting to advanced studies, pre-construction, there are anywhere from 2,000 projects in gold in Canada. Well, when we look at rare earths, there's some, you can see here on this chart, there's really kind of only a handful of projects out there in Canada, and of course there's more coming to the table because of the the new interest. And I would say right now, if we say what's in advanced study, so anything in a PEA, pre-feasibility or feasibility study, there's about 7 at the moment in Canada, and they're across every province. British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, Quebec, Labrador. So they really fall across Canada. And I would say one difference is, we talked about abundance. It's a common thing where we say, how abundant are they? And I will actually go there, because rare earths, they're not actually rare. When you group the list that I showed you on the other chart, they're about, in total, at least as abundant as copper around the world. The only difference is they don't concentrate as much as copper does in some of these big mega deposits like in Chile and others, where typically the grades are lower, and that's always that affects the economics to bring these deposits online. And the other thing are, what do the grades look like? How would you compare typical grades in Canada? And again, it's not every project, but in generally, we say total rare earth, you're looking at somewhere between 1% and 3%. That's typically what you would see in a typical Canadian project. There are about a dozen rare earth minerals, and that's why you need really good mineralogy. So that's my plug for, hey, if you're going to do any exploration, any geology work, you must understand how to set up a process. You need to do great mineralogy. The ones that are more well-known, bastosite, monazite, and eudialyte, but they are not the only ones. Often they are found together. Anyways, like I said, there's about 12 main rare earth minerals.
Right. So as I understand it, it's maybe their rarity is, or what makes them more distinct is maybe their difficulty in I guess separating them than in their rarity. They are one of the challenges is that they come together, or they can be found together and need to be separated out individually. Is that right?
Yeah, if you go back, if you can go back a slide, I've got the rough general process flow sheet. So when you're looking at a project, the question is, where do you stop your production plan? So one of the choices is you can concentrate the rare earths because they're all found together. And again, typically, if we said, what are you looking for in a rare earth project? Typically, we're looking for the lights, the neodymium, praseodymium, so NdPr, because that's what goes into these magnets, permanent magnets. But the heavies, the heavy rare earth elements that kind of add extra economic value, the normal two are terbium and dysprosium, so Tb and Dy. So when you kind of have those 4, that's typically what you're looking at in a rare earth project. But the first question is, do you stop at a concentrate? That's kind of the normal question. Should I at least get to some a mine in a concentrator? But maybe I should go to the next step. So the next step is going to be what we call cracking. You're going to heat the material and you're going to leach it. And usually you're going to precipitate it. Often, it's got a few different forms, but normally, let's say in Canada, we're looking at, carbonates. Typically, we call that product an MREC as a product. So that's another potential stage that you could stop out to say, okay, I'm going to sell that intermediate product. But then you've heard of separation plants, and separation plants means I'm going to take it to the next step. I'm going to separate out the individual rare earth elements. I'm going to put it through solvent extraction, and I'm going to basically start producing and precipitating out the individual oxides. It could be groups of oxides or individual oxides, and that's what we call separation plants. From there, it goes on to alloys, and it goes on to magnet making as, let's say, the main end use demand. But that's typically kind of the process flow of any of these rare earth projects. And the question is, what do you do, again, whether it's in Canada or in other countries, but we're going to talk about that maybe a little bit later.
Okay. Good stuff. All right. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So I want to talk. Let's move on to like the market reality at the moment. Now it's funny. I know the IEA for mostly for their world energy outlook that just seems to focus largely on oil, but what they do extends beyond that. And I think when we are thinking about maybe the headlines at the moment and what has sort of been a catalyst, I think some of the work that they've done recently has played a role. Could you maybe just give us a little background on that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, IEA are known for energy. It's International Energy Agency, and that's the normal. That is mainly what they're looking at, is forecasting. Between looking at fossil fuels and renewables and where the market's going in terms of its global energy mix. Well, guess what? The pull for critical minerals was obvious because of that tie, because it's again tied into that new end use, like I said, renewables, batteries, and so forth. So for the last few years, the IEA started issuing annually their global critical mineral outlook report. And are they, how are they consequential? They are the analyst for the G7. So every time the G7 meet, regardless of, who's the host country, the IEA is the one who is giving the market view, the supply chain risks. Representatives are, major mining companies are represented within the IEA, major mining associations and individuals. So myself, I'm a peer reviewer, and I contributed to the critical mineral outlook. But the one that they issued last May of 2025 was very consequential, because that directly led the opinion of when Canada hosted the G7 last summer, and they were the ones who sort of kicked off that internal view of the supply chain risks ahead.
All right. So what did they have to say in that report that was so consequential?
Yeah, if we look, the first thing they said is the supply concentration over the last 5 years, so from 2020 to 2024, only increased in concentration. Are we getting ahead? And it's in a small number of countries that are kind of controlling that supply chain, and there's a need for diversification. The top 3 producers, of any of these critical minerals was, they control about 86% of the refining capacity in 2024. And this is up from when, in 2020, it was about 82%, and it's only going in one direction. And if we look at this chart in red, that's China. And they are really the majority refiner of most of these critical minerals. And if you look on the right-hand side, cobalt, graphite, rare earths really are the dominant ones, where they're super high, 80-90% plus refining is done out of China.
Okay. And so market share very, very concentrated amongst, well, there's a fantastic slide that you have. I think the next one about just shows, I think, the scope or the scale that, I guess, China, the role that China plays in so many of the critical minerals.
Yeah, if we look at just the largest refiner of any of these top 20 critical minerals, China is the dominant refiner for 19 out of 20. And so everything we see in the media every day, anything critical minerals and rare earths, it's on this chart right here. And the only exception in purple is nickel in Indonesia, but Indonesia is often connected to China as well in terms of, the dominant nickel producer. And what the IEA said, looking forward 10 years, they said, well, we're not going to make a lot of headway, because in the next 10 years, we're only going to get back to the top 3 producers are going to control, 82%, back where we were in 2020. We're not making a lot of headway if we want to create more balance out there and competition in other international markets. And the conclusion of their report was, hey, urgently diversify supply chains, increase investments within G7 countries, and to avoid that massive supply disruptions that could occur when supply chains are constrained.
Right. Well, I think right now we're sort of getting a what's happening in the Middle East, the knock-on effect of supply shocks, and it ripples through, whether it's fertilizer, cost of food. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're probably more attuned to supply shocks now than maybe we have been in a long time. So, and specifically for rare earths, where is the demand? Is the demand changing, or how is it changing?
Yeah, and we talked a few minutes ago about kind of the market for rare earths, and it is somewhere today around like I said, 200,000 tons. Magnet demand is kind of the majority, but it's everyday. The end use is sort of it's the everyday items, because like I said, it's in our phones, it's in our laptops, it's in our electric vehicles. So that is the big pull, and it's because it's so small and it's so efficient. That's why even Tesla, when the first iteration of the Tesla vehicle, they had a copper rotor. I remember, and I was working for a major copper producer, and we were like, that's awesome, more copper in Teslas. Well, they started switching that out into more rare earths because they were more efficient, cost effective, even though they're expensive. But because they're so small, weight and matters. So that's one of the powers of rare earths, is, like I said, it's the unique properties that they provide when it comes to these high tech applications.
Okay. So IEA, working for an analytical firm for the G7, informing G7 policy. That came out last year, raised the concern about just we're not making progress. We're going backwards in terms of diversifying supply, and then I think around that time there were a new administration in the United States, and I think what we've seen people using supply as leverage in negotiations, et cetera. So I think, yeah, let's get to the guts of the geopolitics of this story.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like three key issues in terms of how we got here today, and again, why are rare earths in the media every day, critical minerals and rare earths. The first one is, as you said, it's geopolitical tensions, and first of all, conflict. Are we in an era of increased conflict? The answer is, unfortunately, yes. That's the reality of the world that we live in. And historically, because you said 2009 and rare earths were popular, higher prices back then. Well, it's the same themes repeating itself. It's the only difference is it's come to a head right now. And the central issue is that China has these export restrictions on rare earths and other critical minerals. But the fact that it's constrained does not allow the rest of the market to have its own market, its own development, because most of that refining and downstream processing is done in China. And right now, China covers, their export controls cover at least 12 of the 17 rare earths. That meant, and that's why you see in all the policy language from both, US, EU, and other G7 nations like Canada, they're using wording now, national and economic security is at risk. And so that prompted a lot of actions to be taken. But again, it will continue to be in the media. It's not the end of it, but we're going to talk about now all the actions that have occurred. Next slide. And what really happened was, I'll say starting end of 2024 and specifically in 2025, we saw a massive change when it came to strategic alliances. I'll say amongst the G7, the G20, and NATO, that we saw this, supply chain realignment. When the IEA said we need urgent action, the G7 listened. here's some examples. I'll just say, 2024 EU Critical Raw Materials Act. They've been talking about their critical mineral list before, anyone else, to be honest. But they put this act and said, hey, EU, we're going to do 10% extraction inside the EU. We're going to do 40% processing in the EU, and we're going to recycle, 15% to make these commitments. Although EU has a lot of challenges because they don't naturally have a lot of mine feed and they are dependent on imports, which is good for Canada. But in 2025 was the most consequential. And beginning of the year, March and April, we had some US executive orders. US said, hey, we're going to accelerate our mining supply chain, especially around critical minerals and rare earths. They even had a executive order on deep sea mining. There was a lot of announcements with US government in many countries. One of them was, Australia, $8 billion of cooperation on critical minerals. But then we had the G7 in June of last year. Canada was the host. And that's where I think everything came to a head. They announced that we would have this G7 strategic alliance, what they called behind the scenes buyers club, that all these countries, G7, G20 members could work together, create alliances, and benefit from those that have these resources, and develop processing across those partnerships. And then it got us to kind of what happened in the fall and where we are even today. I mean, Canada made, in its budget in November, it made specific commitments like enacting the Defense Production Act, and said we are going to make significant investments, their sovereign fund, a critical mineral fund, to make sure that they are investing within, domestically in Canada and inviting foreign direct investment in Canada. So there was, 2025 was extremely consequential in terms of announcements and commitments.
Right. And so has the Canadian government specifically outlined like a policy for stockpiling specific critical minerals?
Well, what's happened is, if we look at the Defense Production Act, it's that they enacted in that November budget. It allowed Canada to unlock some new powers. Now, the US already had critical minerals under the Defense Production Act, and Canada, in a way, you could argue, caught up. But it gave it new powers where the Canadian government could directly be a buyer and enter into offtakes. And the ones that they announced first was scandium with Rio Tinto back in the fall, and graphite with Graphite Nouveau Monde. Those are the first two announced. And it allowed them, on top of the offtakes, it allows the Canadian government to directly invest in projects, enter into offtakes, and if they choose, to provide price floors where they choose, and Canadian government is still evaluating that. But those powers are quite significant, because now the Canadian government is the partner and investor, and their goal is they want more sustainable projects to generate positive cash flow. That is the economic reality of, I'll say the Canadian government's interest in accessing these new powers.
So in the case of scandium, Rio Tinto is already producing that scandium, right? And,
yeah,
and
the goal there was, again, they had their own criteria for who they selected first. In terms of that list, those were the first two, like I said, between graphite and scandium. There are others along the way, but again, how they prioritize that's really up to their own criteria. But it is one where there are few scandium players in the world. There are not many, and Canada is one of them.
Right. Okay. So that's policy reaction. And what about in the markets?
Yeah, if we sort of say, so here you have, analysts saying, hey, this is important. You have policymakers, and the individual countries within the G7 saying, we're taking action, we're working together. Well, you can imagine the investment community woke up and said, yeah, we're on it. we're very much aligned, because And some of the notable ones, like JP Morgan said, we're launching a 1.5 billion resiliency fund, and it's going to be investing into supply chain. The first 10 billion is going to be focused on US, and of course, minerals is going to be part of it. Another one, rare earth projects were beneficiaries of obviously that environment, like Linus, which is a project in Australia with a mine in Australia, process plant in Malaysia. They raised new funds on the back of this. They were one of the few producers outside of China. Mountain Pass, United States, which we'll talk about in a moment, was another one, another producer outside of China. But even closer to home, look at Agnico Eagle, Canada's largest mining company, a gold producer. They actually said, we are going to commit to critical minerals. They've made investments in critical minerals, and they opened up their new Avenir mineral unit, and they committed to 130 million in capital with a focus on advancing projects, early stage projects in Canada, critical mineral projects. That's hard if you're a gold producer, to change your stars. Another known one is Ryan Resource. They do a lot of mine financing and investments, but they raised 2 billion for a fund focus on critical minerals, and that was backed by US and UAE government.
Okay. So you mentioned the US, the EU, and so we talked a bit about China. What has been what's been the response outside of China in say, how the market is reacting or developing beyond China?
I'll say two things. First of all, it's the commodity price. That's the lead indicator, and it's the driver of interest. But I think all of the policy announcements, and whether it's, again, EU-based, US-based, Canada-based, and others, like Australia, that gives the confidence for investors to enter the market when they're kind of doing that assessment is, hey, is this the right place in the short, medium, and long term? And again, investors have different interests and different timeframes. But I think if you can sort of see the trend, a lot of these critical minerals and rare earth commodities are here to stay. They're not going anywhere because of that risk. And maybe let's, Ryan, talk about here, the outcome here of what happened.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned Mountain Pass, which was part of the conversation in 2009, and started on, stopped again, and started and stopped. It had a fitful few years. So what's happening? What has changed now with regard to that?
Yeah, we look at American government strategically said, and rare earths are important to our supply chain. We want to control them. There was that was a good example of using the Defense Production Act in the United States. They did four things. They made an equity investment in Mountain Pass. They entered into a 10-year offtake to purchase rare earths, and they gave them a price floor for 10 years, and then they gave them a loan as well. So, U.S. administration are investors in Mountain Pass. So, plus all those extra powers. So that was kind of a signal to the market that countries are getting serious with their policy, and that was a big one that got attention last year in terms of what happened. Going back to what's in front of us here, the G7 Critical Mineral Action Plan, that was the outcome of Canada being the host. They normally at the G7, they come out with a communique where they get all of the G7 countries to agree on a statement. It did not happen. They could not agree, but guess what? They agreed on a critical mineral action plan. And this was directly basically answering the question of what the IEA said. How are we going to diversify the supply chains? I think it's like a 2-page document.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, and this is, so the paragraph here I have in red is directly answering the question, and I'll read it. And I gotta get closer to the screen to read it. But it answers the issue of what are we going to do? Are we going to work together? Well, hell yes. it says here, we have shared national and economic security interests which depend on access to resilient critical mineral supply chains. We recognize non-market policies, and that's wink, wink, that's China, Indonesia, where they're not happy with, which threatens our ability to acquire critical minerals, including rare earths needed for magnets, vital to industrial resilience. We will work together with partners beyond the G7 to swiftly protect economic national security. So the point here is, this is their big words for making a commitment. And at the time, there was a lot of trade issues with Canada and the United States. Well, guess what? United States endorsed the statement because this one was agreed by all the G7 nations. This is what put out, this is what's driving a lot of those plans and those announcements and the billions of dollars of announcements since, in terms of partnerships to diversify away from China. That's basically, I'll call it the inception or the commitment in writing.
Okay. So we've got a couple notes. So you mentioned that the G7, and then shortly after the G7, there was the NATO. There was a NATO meeting that followed that. And
yeah, exactly. The moment they wrapped up the G7 meeting in June, a lot of leaders hopped on the plane. They went over to, I guess, in Brussels, and they made an announcement to say 12 countries, and Canada is the lead. And they basically said, we're going to create, so under NATO, if you have a program, it's called High Visibility Project. It's where multiple nations are working towards, common goals for NATO. The newest one was a critical materials stockpiling initiative. Canada is one of the leads in this, and there's 12 nations at the bottom of the screen. I'm not going to name them all, but I mean, they're all pretty much, EU, UK countries. And guess what? I mean, this is stockpiling is now thinking, planning ahead. That's the purpose of, hey, we don't want to be caught without our proper supply chain for defense. We need to make sure we're stockpiling these valuable critical minerals and rare earths. And Canada was the lead. I was fortunate to present to NATO as a industrial portion of that to talk about, what Canada has to offer.
So, and that happened in June. And let's see. So you and I crossed paths in November, and November was another sort of milestone, because that was sort of when the Canadian government released its budget, and there was a lot of I think direct language about this challenge. What you said, that's when Canada woke up.
We can skip this slide here.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of Canada waking up, like I said, very consequential. Again, we just talked about Mountain Pass. That was an announcement that was made in 2025, prior to Canada's budget. We had other consequential things like Neo Performance opening up a magnet production facility in Estonia. That was one that was a commitment from the auto manufacturers in the EU to say, we're not only going to buy magnets from China, we are going to buy from our own supply chain. By the way, that was Kearney at the G7 with a magnet that I believe that Neo provided, a rare earth magnet, to the ambassador of the EU, and the ambassador of the EU handed it to Kearney at the G7 just to say, we can do it, we can change our stars. And all of these events that I've been talking about led to that, November budget. Defense Production Act was enacted. Canada initiated a $2 billion sovereign critical mineral sovereign fund. And, we all heard that Davos speech by Kearney, which went, around the world, where he talked about sovereignty, and mentioned critical minerals 3 times. And then, like I said, very consequential. And then on top of it, the G7 Production Alliance, with which we've had announcements in November and since, even at PDAC timeframes, There is real momentum. The Canadian government is committed to taking action, making announcements. And of course, behind the scenes, there's so much engagement from an industry, major mining companies, project owners, service people like me. We are all behind the scenes, very engaging the Canadian government, Natural Resources Canada, Department of Defense in a very concrete and meaningful way.
So you're at PDAC in the spring. Not that long ago now, and there was a lot happening there. You said you saw I think the Natural Resource Minister present, what was the message that he was had at that
Yeah,
event?
when Minister Tim Hodgson, it was like Tuesday, there was an announcement of a lot of these awards to Canadian companies in terms of funds that they were granting. If on the TV screen before Minister Hodgson showed up, it says Canada has what the world wants. That is the tagline that the Canadian government has been basically marketing ever since the G7. And that's a fundamental kind of message of, there's this focus of we need to unlock our natural resources in Canada, and that's energy, minerals, focus on domestic production. Number two, attract foreign direct investment. We're not going to do it alone. We don't have the capital markets here at home. And that's why you see all these partners. And that means Canada said their strategies, hey, I got to diversify. I'm going to go to EU. I'm going to go to Asia Pacific, and I'm going to find, new partners. And we're starting to see that. So, that's a lot of the very consistent messaging. And that's what we heard at PDAC. Like I said, on the screen, it says, the Canada has what the world wants, and you're going to hear more of that as we move forward.
And so you mentioned there are 7 projects in Canada that are sort of more advanced in their development, and I think one of them was Torngat, that got a pretty decent sum of money from the federal government, and that raises the question about whether we're going to be picking winners for these projects, which is not generally how these things unfold.
Yeah, I think we're in an environment just because of the urgency of policy, whether it's provincially or federally, because of all the trade issues we're having, the importance of critical minerals, we're seeing, I believe that we're moving to this world of picking winners, because we can't wait to let the capital markets develop on their own. The government as a partner, again, whether it's federally or provincially, has to play a role in unlocking these new supply chains. We need the infrastructure, right? There's like the last mile fund, things like that. And I should say in Canada, I guess we should call it the last kilometer fund. But a good example was, you mentioned Torngat. So EDC, there was an announcement, last year, EDC provided 110 million of financing for Torngat. They, on top of that, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, so CIB, normally they invest in these big mega projects, could be energy, oil and gas, could be transportation. Well, the first investment that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank last year for minerals was Torngat. They gave 55 million, and I believe it was related to the fact that EDC had given them a loan. Mm-hmm. So that's the beginning of Canadian Infrastructure Bank getting in there, and they've said they are going to be open to other projects. It's not exclusive, the only one. It was the first, and it was a rare earth project. Another one, EDC. I know there was an announcement last year with Wichita in British Columbia, another announcement with EDC in terms of funding and so forth. But again, what was consequential was Canada's commitment, and defense was the reason. Defense in November, Canada also enacted a defense infrastructure or industrial strategy document and critical minerals is embedded in that. And that's how we unlocked a lot of those funds. And in fact, in below on the bottom right, that is actually the document. That is the Defense Production Act. That is the beginning of the Canada's Defense Production Act. And it goes on. And you can go to, government website if you want to see what's in there. But we've made real change in 2025, and now we're seeing the consequence of those plans come through. But as I said, there's a lot of discussion on the sidelines, behind the scenes. A lot of us are giving honest and real feedback to these Canadian stakeholders. Like I said, especially these government officials, because we want them to make the best use of these funds. We want to advance, and Canada has a big part to play. And if anyone is going to advance, permitting, we're seeing announcements on permitting in provinces in terms of fast tracking, not sacrificing quality, adhering to still high standards, but there is a push. So
Right.
We need all players.
Yeah, that was actually what I wanted to ask you, sort of conclude, was what do you think we should be looking out for in terms of developments? And you mentioned, yes, the fast tracking. I think more the major projects office, getting more projects referred to them, etc. Any other indicators that or just signs from out there that we should keep our eye on?
I mean, my advice is always, if you want to do your $500 million, $1 billion, multi-billion dollar project you want to develop, we need to treat this like insurance, pre-construction. And the unfortunate reality of the mining industry is, with, management teams and board of directors, the investors are not maybe, don't have that awareness of saying, oh, I'm going to give you what you want. I'm going to give you all the money that you need. That's not the reality of the mining industry. Rare earths is, it's complicated. We need, diligent, robust piloting, for examples, and the studies, because it's multi-element and it's complex, but there's a lot of economic value to be unlocked. So we need to treat these projects like making sure the right funding is happening pre-construction. And, I say that's part of that message to industry and to investors, because, accelerating and skipping steps is not going to serve anyone. It needs to be, if we're going to accelerate, I'll say accelerate with discipline, right? Be robust. Let's build great projects. And it's a paradox. That's the paradox that we live in. But that's always my advice, is let's do it the right way. And that's where we need those multi-stakeholder partners if we're going to advance. Good.
So I've got a few questions here that people have put forward that I wanted to put before you. It's about our ability to refine. Do you think that the refining of rare earth elements can be done here in Canada? And would that look like how it is done in China, or would it look different?
I'll say in Canada, that's the debate that's happening now behind closed doors, where we're talking with the Canadian government. And the debate is always, if you're going to support the industry in Canada, where do you start and where do you stop? I'll say two things. The first one is we should look at it as a phased approach. You're not going to, to get all the way to separation, that's a longer trajectory. We at least need to start getting some mines into production. But the other one is partners. I can tell you that from an EU, when it comes to rare earths, the one that gets the Canadian government excited is creating much stronger ties, that we do some form of processing in Canada. Does it mean we do the separation, plant those final stages to get to the oxide? Do we do it in Canada, or do we have some partners in the EU as an example? That's really what's being debated now in terms of economics. But this all goes back to partners. So every time we discuss it with Canadian government, they will say, ooh, that's good for bilateral trade discussions. So there are bigger things at stake, at play, in terms of how we do it, because that's what brings the large capital in terms of those discussions. It really is geopolitical.
Somebody else asked, and sort of a question that I think I had put to you as well, was, do we have the do we have the expertise? Do we have the talent that we need to do to build these projects here?
Absolutely. The technical talent in Canada, whether it's from a process development, engineering, is of the best. And we have great talent. And I'll say even in-house, and even our own team at SGS, you won't find any, better people in terms of that process development, piloting capabilities on the planet. But the challenge will be for engineering companies, they're going to be faced with competition. So there's gold, there's copper, there's multi-critical mineral projects. At some point, someone's going to say, hey, whoa, I don't have enough people. There's too much liability. I'm going to say no to this project. And the risk is you go to a lower tier engineering firm to where maybe they're not really good, or, they can't handle that complexity. That's the risk that we face, is the sheer number of projects going forward, because people are going to partner with the best. So, the people that are kind of towards the end may not get the best quality. So that really is, I think, the risk for Canada. It's the workforce, especially in some of these more remote communities. You're going to need trades as well. It's not just the pure technical. Those trades are just as important.
So, I know, can you speak at all to the Canada's position as it relates to Canadian companies choosing to work with both Canada and U.S. secure supply programs, and participating in vaults and offtake agreements? We seem to have a contentious relationship right now with our southern neighbors, but at the same time, they are, they have a big role to play in I think the projects that we're doing and the agreements that we have. I don't know. Can you speak at all about what those?
Yeah. So let's just dive. I mean, Canada needs end use markets for rare earths, because like most commodities are, 10% of U.S. population is not big enough for our own domestic needs for pretty much almost any commodity. So we need strong end use markets. So if we look at rare earths, is the U.S. the home for rare earths? With what the investment that the U.S. is making in Mountain Pass and others, they've said they want to invest in other companies. Like I think USA Rare Earth was one that they announced. The U.S., at least this point, from at least what the analysts tell us, will be more self-sufficient in terms of its own production and downstream demand. That means Canada really has to look both east and west for its end-use markets. This is kind of what I said earlier on. It's going to go, Asia Pacific and EU are going to be those end-use partners that are going to look to strengthen. And trust me, they're all vulnerable. They all know it. So that is a benefit for Canada in terms of finding that strong end-use demand. And that's why we do see it. Again, I mentioned trade, Global First Canada, bilateral trade with countries. Trust me, critical minerals and rare earths are in that discussion every day, all the time.
Good. Well, I think I don't have any more questions here in the lineup. I really want to thank you, David, for your time. I think it's been great to get some context and background on this, and it's been definitely a useful conversation for me. I hope it was also very helpful for people that joined us today. So again, thank you, David, for this. Welcome back, Michelle.
Thank you. And thank you, David. That was really interesting. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and ask that you please fill out the short survey that pops up on your screen at the close of the webinar. A link to today's webinar will be, the recording of the webinar will be sent to you tomorrow by email. Keep an eye out on the calendar of events at CIM.org for webinars like this. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.